Imagine waking up one morning and half your neighborhood is completely gone. Your neighbors, your children, your parents, your closest friends, all dead, all vanished, and nobody around you can explain why. Nobody has a cure. Nobody has an answer. And that is not a horror movie. That is not a nightmare. That is the actual lived reality of millions and millions of human beings across history. And today we're going to go through every single deadliest year this world has ever seen, because the numbers we are about to talk about are so massive, so mind-bending, so almost impossible to wrap your brain around, that by the time this video is over, the way you look at human history will never be the same again. Let us start all the way back in 1347, because in that year, a fleet of ships docked at the port of Sicily in Italy, and the port authorities who walked up to those ships to greet the sailors were met with something so horrifying that they immediately ordered the ships to leave. The sailors on board were either already dead or they were covered head to toe in black, oozing, pus-filled boils that were leaking blood, and the smell coming off those ships was unbearable. But here is the terrifying part. It was already too late. The disease had already reached the shore, and within weeks it had spread into the cities. And within months it had crossed into France, into Spain, into Germany, into England. And it was moving so fast, killing so efficiently, that people genuinely believed the world was ending, that God had abandoned them, that this was the apocalypse. And they were not entirely wrong to think that, because what we now call the Black Death, bubonic plague, would go on to kill an estimated 75 to 200 million people across Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. And to put that into a perspective that actually hits you in the gut, Europe alone lost somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of its entire population, meaning if you were alive in Europe in 1347, and you looked around at your village, your town, your city, roughly every other person you could see was going to be dead within the next 4 years. Entire villages were completely wiped off the map with no survivors. There were so many dead bodies piling up in the streets that cities ran out of places to bury people. Priests refused to give last rites because they were terrified of getting infected themselves. Doctors wore those now iconic bird-shaped masks stuffed with herbs because they thought bad air was causing the disease, and the social fabric of medieval society just completely collapsed. The economy crashed. The church lost its authority because people asked, how could God let this happen? Peasants who survived started demanding better wages because there were suddenly not enough workers, and the world would not see its population recover to pre-plague levels for over 150 years. 150 years. Think about that. Think about how long that is, and that is what the Black Death did to the human race. But now let us jump forward to 1918, because even though the Black Death killed more people overall, the year 1918 might be the single most catastrophic individual year in all of modern recorded history. And here's why. The world in 1918 was already on its knees. World War I had been grinding on since 1914 and had already killed around 20 million people. Soldiers were living in muddy trenches filled with rats and disease and poison gas. Civilians across Europe were starving because food was being diverted to the war effort. The entire world was exhausted and broken and desperate for it all to end. And then, as if God himself wanted to kick humanity while it was already down, the Spanish flu arrived in the spring of 1918. And what made this flu so uniquely terrifying, so different from any flu the modern world had ever seen, was that it did not kill the old and the weak the way normal flu does. Instead, this strain was most lethal for young, healthy adults between the ages of 20 and 40, meaning it was targeting the very soldiers on the front lines, the very factory workers keeping the economy running, the very young parents raising the next generation, and it spread like absolute wildfire, because you had hundreds of thousands of soldiers packed together in trenches and barracks and transport ships with no way to social distance. No understanding of how viruses spread, no antibiotics, no ventilators, no intensive care units, nothing, and by the time 1918 was over, the Spanish flu had infected an estimated 500 million people, which was 1/3 of the entire global population at the time, and it killed somewhere between 50 and 100 million of them in a single year. Let that sink in. More people died from the flu in 1918 than died in all 4 years of World War I combined. And in certain weeks of October 1918, historians estimate that over 5,000 Americans were dying every single day just in the United States alone, cities across. America ran out of coffins. Philadelphia was digging mass graves with steam shovels because there was no other way to handle the volume of dead bodies. Nurses and doctors were collapsing from exhaustion and then dying themselves, and governments were actively suppressing news about the flu because they did not want to hurt morale during the war. So people were dying in massive numbers without even fully understanding what was killing them. And 1918 stands to this day as arguably the single most deadly year in the entire modern era. Now here is one that most people have never even heard of, and it might genuinely be the worst year in all of human history. Not because of war, not because of plague, but because the sky literally went dark. We're talking about 536 AD, and what happened in that year was that a massive volcanic eruption, most likely in Iceland, blasted so much ash and sulfur dioxide into the upper atmosphere that it created a thick fog that blocked out sunlight across Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Asia. And this was not a temporary thing. This fog lasted for 18 solid months, a year and a half of the sun being blocked out. And the consequences were absolutely catastrophic because without sunlight, temperatures dropped by 1.5 to 2.5 degrees Celsius across the northern hemisphere. Crops failed because there was not enough light or warmth to grow them. Snow was recorded falling in China during the summer months. Droughts hit Peru. Ireland recorded crop failures 4 years in a row. And people were watching their food supplies disappear with absolutely no understanding of why it was happening. No way to fix it, no way to get help. And the famine that followed was devastating enough on its own. But then 536 AD set off a chain reaction because the famine weakened populations across multiple continents. And then in 541 AD, the plague of Justinian arrived and tore through those already starving and weakened populations, and historians estimate that the combination of volcanic winter, famine, and plague may have killed between 25 and 50 million people over the following decade. And the climate cooling that started in 536 triggered what scientists now call the Late Antique Little Ice Age, which lasted for over a century and contributed to the fall of the Roman Empire and the collapse of multiple other civilizations. And Harvard medieval historian Michael McCormick studied this period extensively and concluded that 536 AD was the beginning of one of the worst periods to be alive in all of human history. And when a Harvard historian says that about a specific year, you know it was genuinely catastrophic. Moving into the 20th century, we have to talk about 1943 through 1945, the peak years of World War II, which as a whole is the deadliest conflict in all of recorded human history, killing an estimated 70 to 85 million people. But within those years, the scale of deliberate, industrialized, systematic killing reached levels that the world had never imagined possible and has never seen since. Because during this period, the Nazi regime was running death camps at full capacity, systematically exterminating 6 million Jewish men, women, and children, along with millions of Polish civilians, Roma people, disabled people, and political prisoners, all murdered not in the chaos of battle, but in an organized, bureaucratic, factory-like process of mass murder that was so methodical and so calculated that it represents one of the greatest moral catastrophes in the history of the human species. And simultaneously, the Soviet Union was losing over 27 million of its citizens to the war. Cities like Leningrad were under siege for 872 days, with people starving and freezing to death by the thousands. And then 1945 specifically saw the firebombing of Dresden and Tokyo that killed tens of thousands of civilians in single nights. The fall of Berlin with brutal street-by-street combat. And then in August of 1945, the United States dropped 2 atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki and killed an estimated 110,000 to 210,000 people in 2 strikes, 2 cities, 2 bombs. And the world changed forever, because for the first time in history, humanity had a weapon powerful enough to end all life on Earth, and we had just used it. Then there is a chapter that Western history books almost completely ignore, and it is honestly a disgrace that it does not get more attention. Because between 1959 and 1961, China experienced what is now considered the deadliest famine in all of human history. And it was not caused by drought or natural disaster. It was caused by the catastrophically misguided and stubbornly enforced policies of Mao Zedong's Great Leap Forward, a political campaign that was supposed to rapidly transform China into an industrial superpower, but instead caused one of the greatest human-made disasters in history, because the government forced farmers off their land and into factories and communes. They set grain production quotas that were completely impossible to meet. Local officials were so terrified of reporting failure to Beijing that they lied about how much grain they were producing. And then when the crops failed and the real numbers came in, and the famine began to spread across the countryside. The Chinese government continued to export grain to the Soviet Union and other countries because they did not want to admit publicly that the Great Leap Forward was failing. And so what? Chinese peasants were literally starving to death in their villages. Grain was leaving the country on ships, and people were reduced to eating tree bark and leather and grass, and in some documented cases resorting to things so desperate we will not even say them here. And the death toll from this famine is estimated at anywhere between 15 million and 55 million people in just 3 years, with the year 1960 alone possibly accounting for 15 million deaths. And for decades afterward, the Chinese government suppressed all information about what had happened, so the rest of the world did not fully understand the scale of this catastrophe until many years later. And before we close, the honorable mentions. 1241, when the Mongol armies swept into Europe and the Middle East at the height of their power, and the overall Mongol conquest under Genghis Khan and his successors killed an estimated 40 million people, depopulating entire regions of Central Asia. 1816, known as the year without a summer, when the 1815 eruption of Mount Tambora in Indonesia caused global temperature drops, crop failures across North America and Europe, and widespread famine that killed tens of thousands and triggered mass migrations. In 1994, when in just 100 days between April and July, the Rwandan genocide saw approximately 800,000 to 1 million Tutsi people systematically slaughtered by their own neighbors with machetes and clubs in a wave of organized ethnic violence so fast and so total that the speed of the killing was unprecedented in the modern era, and the world largely stood by and watched it happen. So what is the real lesson here? What is the thread that connects every single one of these catastrophic years across all of human history? It is this: death does not just happen randomly. Death multiplies, death explodes. Death reaches these incomprehensible scales when systems break down, when governments lie to their people or fail them, or actively murder them, when warning signs are ignored. When the structures that hold society together, food supply, public health, political, accountability, basic human empathy, when those things collapse, the dead pile up in numbers that the human brain can barely process. And that is exactly why we have to keep studying these moments. Not to be morbid, not to despair, but because understanding the conditions that allowed these catastrophes to happen is the only real protection we have against letting them happen again. And if this video made you think, if it made you feel something, if it taught you something you did not know before, hit that like button right now. Drop in the comments which years shocked you the most, and I will see you in the next one.